Shall we start maybe? If everyone is cool. Thanks so much for all of these wonderful people for coming. So this is going to be a short, well, we'll go until 7 p.m. I think we'll see how that goes. So it's going to be a roundtable discussion with Luiza Crosman, Bahar and Bahar Noorizadeh and Erik Bordeleau. This is in collaboration with our System Safari seminar that we have a project that's been published this morning. If you want to check it out, I'll post it on the chat, which is the Arbeit on screen. So in collaboration with Arbeit, which I would very heavily recommend. And I'd also like to just thank quickly Ellie Clark, who's followed us along the way. So Yasmin, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you, Kobe, for opening up the session. So yeah, I just want to say a few words or maybe like a few paragraphs around what the basis of this talk is, why these people around these topics. And I might be reading from some things that I've written. I thought like, yeah, I hope that's not going to be disturbing that much. So more than anything, this talk is to touch on the systemics of art, its infrastructures, and for that, the capacities it brings about for speculating on alternative economies and practices initiated within art. As infrastructures are core to all systems, including art. So one question is how art mobilizes infrastructural changes to another end, and what practices doing that look like. On economy part of it, this notion of economy differs from the expertise discourse of basically the technical modeling that can be alienating for us and the understanding of it as an inevitable natural entity that is untouchable. Thinking on this, as stated by Davies in his latest text that I can also like copy in the chat, is that markets are social institutions. They're socially constructed and driven and hence moral institutions. This means that the politics approaching them changes. They are then equally artificial, so we might as well experiment, risk, and plan within the capacities of that and through contemporary art. I think this is also a good moment for this discussion as the virus crisis and its aftermath, forcing us into maybe a future point, has proven the current market-oriented economy to be very limited and questionable. It has also made possible other formations, value systems, and models of governance, although in very small scales or just as proposals. Again, and for the last time, borrowing from Davies, all externalities to the price system are now essential to our economy, and more important than that, for me, at least the logic that no alternative exists ceases to work rhetorically. To put it more simply, the economy as we have it right now is, well, honestly, not working. And this is a global condition reproducing severe inequalities. Also, it's the economy in which the future promise of something good to come, charging and running the present moment as it's always been, is less reliable than ever. This will be in line with reconsidering our position to art and economy for the specific purpose of this talk, looking into alternative economies and platforms. The last point that I want to raise is around the planning in its abstract terms in relation to the specific and how that accounts for the locale. It's a question of scale and temporalities, which particularly comes up in relation to material practices, thinking around the idea of translation and what is lost in between. We need, or basically like this is more of a question for me, a grammar or a toolkit that is able to think upon these issues and connect the two ends of also the ideological and practical. So with that note, I want to pass the screen and the mic to Luisa to kind of like open the presentations for us. And thank you.
Hi, thanks Yasmin. Hi everyone. I'll be sharing my screen. But first, I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this roundtable. I made a small deck showing a few of my works and a few prompts, like a few ideas. I'm more interested in having time for discussion, so I'm not going to go super in depth in each of these projects, but feel free to post questions on the chat or to save them for later so we can have like more time for discussion and to listen to the other two speakers as well. So I'm gonna share my screen now. And I'm guessing that you can all see. Yeah. A thumbs up if you can see. Yeah, okay. So yeah, so I'm Luisa. I'm a Brazilian artist. I'm right now isolating in Rio de Janeiro. I'm in Brazil. I was actually in Moscow before doing the Strelka Institute program. So the crisis really like hit me hard. It made me come back to Brazil. I work as an artist and I frame my practice as an artist, but I also see myself as a teacher, as a cultural organizer, as a researcher, as a writer. And more and more, I've been understanding my practice as system, like system as practice. So it's not exactly to talk about systems, but trying to come up with systems, to implement them, and to analyze forms of putting forward new systems for the art world. So I'm less interested in this idea of a subjective experience or a not determinate experience of the artwork, and I'm more interested in trying to do work that actually puts itself against a grid of parameters or rules or propositions that later can kind of be looked back upon and understood where it was successful or where it failed. Of course, my work always going to correspond to my personal point of view, but I think it's a very important distinction to understand that it's not about necessarily my subjective experience of the art system, but this externality of it. So how I'm seeing how it unfolds in different locations, and etc. As I said, I do many different activities as an artist, but basically I just want to frame for this presentation that I am interested in publishing. So publishing discourse and publishing ideas. Also creating art products. So actually understanding the art object as a product in itself. And finally, creating interventions and experimentations within the infrastructural or the institutional side of art. I'm going to talk first about one of my latest projects, which is this installation I presented at VILS, which is a Belgian institution in Brussels. And the basic idea of this installation was to work as an information architecture. So I was realizing as I went forward with my practice, the need to also kind of set a framework of voices and subjects around this idea of infrastructure and systemic conditions. In general, it's not an issue that it's talked so much about. We can see the last few years this discourse gaining a bit of more force, but it's still very detached from the art world in general. So for me, this installation was really about trying to put a lot of this discourse together and creating some sort of almost like a visual manifesto on these issues. And for that, I put together a lot of drawings, a lot of writing from my own writing, but also I inserted a few QR codes. I'm not sure, yeah, I can point. So I inserted like 20 or 22 QR codes within the installation, which would link the visitor to elsewhere, to sites on the internet where people who are also developing this idea of infrastructure or system, or how technologies of systems are interacting with the culture world. Another feature of this work, which is something that I've been using as recurring in my practice, is inviting other people to kind of collaborate, giving some sort of input. So for this work, I invited a curator called Marília Loureiro and a philosopher called Jean-Pierre Caron. Both are from Brazil, and they gave specific talks on curating and philosophy of subjectivity. And in a way, it was an idea of creating this idea, starting to create this idea also of platform. So instead of a platform that happens in the internet, a platform that's also happening within the space of the institution. I think what this project brought very it really tried to put forward was this idea that culture is a design and strategic object. So we tend to kind of think that culture is kind of this emergent thing that it's happening, and it's sometimes taken or captured, and the marginal becomes the hegemonic, and etc. But what I'm trying to actually propose is that we can actually design a strategy for culture. And I'm interested in that idea. And this is something that I would like to discuss with you. Another thing is that this work was trying to put forward was this idea of the scale of the art institution. So more and more, I've been understanding that in order to act through the infrastructural part of art, it's very hard to do it as a single actor, as an artist, but it's also very hard to do it as a collective, even if you're like more than just one artist, if you are like a collective of artists. And so I'm trying to see how the art space or the art institution is actually not only the medium, but the scale for which we can act on this side of art. So in a way, the art institution or the art space, and I use these two denominations because it doesn't really matter if it's an independent space or if it's a for-profit one. They kind of mediate the relationship between different levels of the infrastructure of art. They mediate the relationship with the city, with the audience, with legislation sometimes. And so I think that it's a very interesting place to act on. Understanding these levels and understanding that actually this, like the idea of system is about also about diagrams and about relationships is also something that in my practice I try to exercise. So for me, it's really important to kind of map out these relationships, to kind of step away from a very exhausted and already empty discourse of criticality. So we see constantly the idea of like fighting neoliberalism or colonial or decolonial practices and things like that. But it's necessary to kind of locate where these issues are happening, to actually diagram the relationships which they enact. And then in a way, for me, it's also some sort of like visual practice to kind of change the diagram and then to be able to change the system, to be able to propose a different proposition. So in one way, like this relationship with the layers of the infrastructure of art happens in this project, which I did with Bahar. I'm not sure if he's also going to talk about it, but I'm going to be short, which is this art education platform that we did during the Summer Academy, which was this residency based in Bern, Switzerland. And the thing here is that we understood the relationship of art education and gentrification in a very specific way, that art education is also being gentrified. And in that sense, because we are also a group of 8 people distributed in different locations, we had to come up with a project that could deal with this kind of planetary scope problem, which is gentrification, but that manifests itself very locally. Within each city, it manifests differently. So just to tie back to this idea of the diagramming, this is where I think it's very useful to kind of understand how specific conditions affect planetary issues. So you can actually propose models that can or cannot be replicated as elsewhere. So the diagram is also kind of like a model, like the diagram can be a model for kind of importing or exporting practices that are happening within the systemic scale. And all of this is kind of leading to this idea of thinking the artwork as a platform. So in a way, it's like almost like trying to step out of the artwork as just an object or artwork as a discourse or an institutional critique, but trying to put all these things together and propose it as something that can step beyond that and actually enact different systems, enact different experimentations. A few things that I'm particularly interested in doing artworks that behave as platforms are these 3 things. So first is this idea of setting the conditions. two is the idea of hidden agendas, and third is the idea of redistribution of resources. So first, the setting of conditions. In a way, to talk about systemic and infrastructural change, we also have to understand that it's not about necessarily like creating a criticism of the art world, of its infrastructure, of its systems, but actually trying to propose a different kind of conditions, different kinds of conditions of possibility. And for that, we'll have to kind of exercise a muscle in experimenting these conditions. So setting the conditions for me, it's also an idea of prototyping. So in a way, the artwork has this kind of ambiguous place where, you know, it can be very protected because it can be free. It's about, you know, like it can be very indeterminate, etc. And we can use that as to create this kind of stealth image to actually propose this kind of hidden agendas. And then I'm gonna give a project afterwards that's gonna make this more clear, because I'm thinking it's a bit abstract right now, but to actually propose a project that it's being enacted as an artwork, but is actually trying to prototype these different kinds of conditions for itself. So the project that I'm gonna like wrap up with is Trama, which I did in 2018. It's a project that was commissioned by the São Paulo Biennial here in Brazil. So the São Paulo Biennial is the largest biennial in Latin America. It's also the second one that existed in the world. So it's a very big institution, and it's a very big event. And I was interested with Trama to propose some sort of, well, to experiment with all these ideas, but also to propose some sort of mediation instead of mediation between the artwork and the public, to mediate the artwork with the institution. So the work is very much tied to the institutional sphere of the biennial itself. So here you can see it's an installation. So this was what was presented at the exhibition. There was the public would come in and it would see this installation there. And through this installation, a few different things were happening. So one of them was these big posters that you can see, one here on the right, and a few on these metal shelves. And on each of these posters, there would be a QR code that would link to a text. And the idea here was to propose the biennial as an editorial agent. So, for example, one of the things when I talk about trying to locate the issues of the infrastructure of the art world, one of the issues is, for example, translation. In Brazil, we have this very dated editorial content on art. There's a lot of still quoting text from 10 years ago because of an issue of translation and of lack of resources in that area. And so for me, the biennial, for example, instead of being an institution that would just promote this exchange of international artists, could also actually be an editorial agent in promoting translation from Brazilian authors for other languages to other languages and vice versa. So for this experiment, this prototype on a kind of editorial strategy for the biennial, I proposed 5 texts from these 5 authors, so Vitória Ivanova, Patricia Reed, Keller Esterling, Iliana Fokenaki, and Sara Ahmed. And they were translated to Portuguese through a collaboration with a publisher. So this is a kind of a second layer of the work, which is the idea is not that I become the editorial agent, nor that the biennial itself creates a publisher for that. It's actually to locate what already exists in the infrastructure of the city, of the country. So for example, Zazie Edições, which is an online publisher, they were already doing this kind of work. They were already doing the work of translating texts. It's a publisher tied to the public university here. So the idea is more to kind of put these two things together, is to say to the biennial that the biennial can use its resources to distribute through different agents of that system. It's not to kind of reinvent the wheel, but actually to tap on things that are already in place. So through this collaboration with Zazie Edições, we translated these 5 texts. We published them online. They're like PDFs. And through the installation, you could access them through the QR codes. But you could also access them through the Facebook page, the Biennial's website, etc. In a way, this was kind of also a dislocation of the event itself. So we were having access from people. Brazil is, of course, you know, a huge country. And we were having access from people from the north part of the country. We had access from people from Portugal. So it's also, in a way, a kind of dislocation of the specific place, which is São Paulo. And then a second intervention or experimentation with this kind of systemic thinking, it's twofold. So first, the proposition was to put solar panels within the São Paulo Biennial building. So here you can see they installing the solar panels. And then through the solar panels to mine Ethereum, which is a cryptocurrency, it's a cryptocurrency that runs in a blockchain. I'm pretty sure everyone here knows what I'm talking about, but if not, you can ask questions. And São Paulo, so the São Paulo Biennial building is this huge modernist construction by Oscar Niemeyer, and it's like protected by all kinds of heritage laws, and you cannot really do anything with it. But at the same time, the São Paulo Biennial building has 12,000 square meters of a rooftop, which are currently used for nothing. So what this collaboration with Pedro proposed was actually to turn this kind of very physical infrastructure resource, which is a rooftop, which at that point was being used just to kind of protect the building itself, as an economic resource by installing the solar panels and connecting it to the cryptocurrency miner. For this experiment, it's much more about the idea of the prototype and the possibility of kind of enacting it than actually the economical results, because the economical results were kind of a failure, especially because 2018 was the year that like cryptocurrency just kind of went downhill. But so here you can see the miner. And here you can see the electrical system that was connected to the solar panels on the rooftop. So in a way, it was this idea to, one, create an economic resource from an infrastructural resource of the institution, and two, to use then this economic resource to propose a different kind of diagram of relationships within the city. So the idea was to use whatever amount we mined through the cryptocurrency miner to do an event in another location in the city to support another venue in the city. So also kind of establishing something that is usually very hidden in the art world, the interdependency of the context. So it kind of doesn't matter if you have this one big institution that is promoting a biennial, if you don't have the smaller institutions or the independent spaces or the off spaces or the galleries itself to kind of promote the rich environment that we kind of need to actually be able to circulate different kinds of art. So it was also about distributing the resources of this huge institution to other places within the city. And here on the left, you can see, it's a very bad image now that I see it's kind of pixelated, but you can also see the proposal for the permanent installation of the solar panel. So we were also interested that the biennial would keep the solar panels and actually try to expand their how do you say, their installing throughout the rest of the rooftop, because we couldn't, of course, install solar panels in 12,000 square meters. We put only this 6. Yeah, so I think I'm not sure if like I try to be brief because I want to save a bit more time for discussion, but I think a few things that come with this 3 ideas. So the idea that system can be a practice, the idea that culture is a design strategic object, and the idea that artworks can act as a platform, is that it's much more about prototyping, modeling, designing, creating experiments, and kind of through trial and error, understanding how we can actually enact a different system on alternative infrastructure for art. But at the same time, that we need to do that in kind of a coordinated way. And also, of course, coordinated, but also collaborative way. So it's also about dissolving this idea of a single artist or the artist as a single agent. Yes, that's it for me for now. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Am I going next? Yes, Amy?
Oh, yes. You're the next one.
All right, so I think it's good I'm going after Luisa. No, I don't want to leave this meeting because, I mean, there's a lot of mutual points of contact, both with Luisa and Erik, so I think I act as a bridge in this conversation. This morning, I actually had a realization about a good way of kind of dividing what I want to talk about based on 3 projects. So I'm selectively choosing 3 projects from the past that correspond to the theme of this discussion. And that's actually good for me because I could actually see 3 modes of political engagement with art and economy through these 3 projects and where I stand now in relation to those. So I'm not as picturesque as Luisa also, but I have 3 slides. She's the artist. I'm some kind of fake artist. So I'm just gonna share 3 slides before moving on. And I have my notes on the screen, so I can't actually share my screen the whole time. I don't even know how to do this, desktop or preview. Okay, I don't know how this is working, but. So the first project is the art protocol. And I'm gonna stop sharing by the way. I'm very confused about this. Do you still see my screen?
Yeah, it looks good. I think we can see a slideshow.
Yeah,
but oh, you see the slideshow? Because like I want to read my notes. I don't want my notes to show. You don't see. You just see the preview.
To be honest, that's going to be complicated. If I were you, I would just like cancel my screen share. Unless you don't.
Oh, stop share. Okay, got it. All right. So basically, this the art protocol with that kind of revolutionary poster was a project that I started in Beirut in 2017 almost with a collaborator friend Ghalia Saadawi. Basically we're researching the primary question was what would be the best way to formalize and give contractual form to the mass of informal practices that we call contemporary art today. And just to emphasize, the intention wasn't really some kind of like self-indulgent kind of engagement with artists and art workers to give them back their kind of like, you know, inherent right. But really at the core of this relationship between contemporary art and its economy is how contemporary art becomes an accomplice in real estate development and various forms of culture and critical washing of urban spaces that Luisa mentioned with that project with Block that we're doing. So in a way, the way that we formulated the idea was to be able to tackle that And, you know, as any demand for contractual relations basically entails, the question really is how to engineer social solidarity with artists in a precarious environment, because the primary issue is artists are traveling all the time, they're based in different places, and there's basically the relation to their institution is so temporary and unstable that there's no mode of kind of continuous engagement. So basically, how can they use the powers given to them by their collective to resist this capital appropriation of their work? And of course, there's a history of unionizing activism in various artistic hubs. But basically, our diagnosis was that contemporary arts, as we call it, the cultural logic of neoliberalism, and it's very distinct from any other form of art. So we are not equating, you know, art practices in general with contemporary art, but what we call contemporary art is, by definition, there are three axioms that goes into it. And of course, a lot of it I'm borrowing from Suhail Madek, who's the director of the MFA program at Goldsmiths, and I'm sure a lot of people on this talk are familiar with. But one is that it's a transnational network, and basically to be included in its network, first you have to be privileged with a visa status and a citizenship status. And second, it's actually very much embodied in a very pre-internet sense. And the experience that it offers basically its audience still very much demands like bodies in spaces, which is bodies that can travel to, you know, the spaces of the biennial, the fair, and this is a prerequisite for its economy to function. And lastly, the third axiom, and this is why the art market is kind of distinct from the real market of goods and services, is the fact that art is absolutely invaluable. So the value of art is beyond, you know, any kind of, you know, like we think of art as that thing that kind of like goes beyond, you know, the notion of value in objects, but at the same time it's priced. And the price is basically the other name for when the institutional credit that's attached to the asset, that's the artwork, is turned liquid. And this institutional credit, who's the artist bodies in the art world, quite literally it's a network of friendships and associations, is what we call the prestige economy. And of course, there's a price for this friendship. So what you invest in to raise the price of your work and yourself throughout your schooling is basically this friendship credit. And the cash you give to that luxurious studio practice program is retributed basically as prestige tokens that accumulates in your piggy bank of an artist. You know, and also like, as we know, the prestige doesn't come from your, you know, Iranian mom in Tehran or like some micro gallery in Cairo. But those friends that you should actually care for having are primarily in Europe and the US. So basically, to be a contemporary artist in Tehran, you must get an MFA from Goldsmiths or Bard. Like this, there's no other way. So basically, these three aspects, the transnational condition, the attachment to bodies in space, in spaces, and the basically illiquid and the segregated friendship market of art. And it's illiquid because like you accumulate these friendship tokens for years, but like they hardly cash out. So these 3 points point to the fact that basically any attempt at taking art out of its hyper-atomized social form cannot be locally specific. So because the rules of engagement and legal frameworks differ from country to country, but they're still very hyper-connected, a solution that's not scalable is not a solution, basically. And to regulate this informal economy of art, it's really the question is the question of transnational governance. And this is where the project of me and Ghalia kind of finished as vaporware, that most projects are, but I could kind of talk about it for years to come and build other projects out of it. And I mean, I made a film that came, you know, kind of like a precedent to these conversations, but I'm not gonna discuss that. I'm gonna actually jump cut into block as the second project. I'm not gonna show my slides. I don't think they're important actually. So block that Luisa gave an intro to, which comes from building leverage over creative capitalism. And I called the subtitle Naming and Shaming. So that was in 2017, almost kind of immediately after the protocol, which was, we went to this residency program in Summer Academy Paul Klee in Bern, with 7 other artists, everyone from some part of the world. Like we had people coming from the US, Beirut, Brazil, Europe. And the director of the program, Tirda Zolqadr, I don't know if Tirda's watching this, but I sent him the link too. He designed the call for the fellowship around his long-term project, which is a relationship of contemporary art to urban renewal and gentrification. And essentially what he did, he prolonged the program from its yearly format to 2 continuous years with the same group of participants. Which is a quite rare instance of implementing continuity in this hop-in, hop-out residency model of art. And that allowed for something to really germinate in these 2 years. And when we gathered in August, basically the proposition was whether we could design a project and work on it together over these coming 2 years around these problematics. And very, very early on, basically, the intention was, one, not to fall in the usual kind of romanticizing trap of the, you know, the problem is too big and the fight is lost and all we can do as artists is to, you know, fall into the form of irony and metaphor and reductive representation. But really, like, the question was how we can make a project to work. And this sounds very basic outside the space of art, but I think with kind of this embodied sadomasochistic kind of relationship with failure that artists have, I think that was like a very early instance of, for me, like working on a project that's very goal oriented and it's not gonna, you know, stay pleased with just the research, which kind of happened with the protocol, I would say. And through many discussions, then by the end of summer, I mean, it became very kind of apparent that any level of real action in these topics has to start from appropriating the pedagogical possibilities of art programs. And basically, how come we learn critical theory from the first year of BA, but nothing that situates our practice in its material context. Like this is very, you know, critical in terms of thinking about art's relation to space. So the intention was to build an educational platform and some kind of accompanied syllabus that we could propose to art schools to add to their curriculum, and each of us would be the educators that could travel along the syllabus and preach our gospel. And secondly, it was a matter of designing incentives and attractors to get people to listen to us. And this sounds kind of, you know, bit like shameful when you're practicing as an artist, because, you know, you're not supposed to like think about incentives and attractors. Like there's something a bit like perverse about thinking about art in those terms, but we are discussing forms of direct activism and organizing that takes place in the US, for example, as some of our members were affiliated with the Boyle Heights housing crisis and collectives in LA, or homeless shelters in Lausanne. And knowing basically the conventions of art and its institutions, we realize there's something to bank on in terms of the moral virtue of critical spaces of art, that the form of shaming can actually be adopted in a direct or diplomatic sense to make a demand. And I think this is kind of key. I'm going to come back to this later. And thirdly, it was a question of system design for our project. One was that we are not experts in, urbanism, especially not all locations that we are dealing with, apart from one person in the group who was doing her PhD in geography. And then we had some heated arguments on what artists are experts of anyways. And there was a lot of self-flagellation, of course, over that. But so we had to compensate for this lack of situated knowledge with engineering within this model a space for external collaborations. And second, in terms of system design, it was a question of engineering continuity, considering the precarity of the art field that we're functioning in, and the fact that we came from very separate spaces, and just the fact of communication over 2 years was draining. So just the idea of how we can sustain such a project to carry on was really, it wasn't like, what I'm saying is that these weren't arbitrary terms that were attached to the project. These were actually fundamentally part of defining the project. So the modular format of the platform, that's as a series of basically autonomous but interlinked educational blocks, came into being out of that. And each of us was in charge of their own module. This way we could downsize communication. But the combination of the modules could work together if some institution was interested in inviting a number of us. And then within each location, we would find partners, neighborhood activists, organizer, artists that could basically bring in that site-specific knowledge to the classroom. And then the fees we would receive from the institutions were supposed to be, the necessary funding that could sustain the project. So to go back to that critical strategy that I mentioned before, which is banking on the moral economy, we know this is the quintessence of contemporary arts ethos, and in a way the shaming methodology that is taken up by, for example, Decolonize This Place in New York and similar examples is basically it's a practice in discrediting and counter speculating on the work of financial speculation, financial institutions that the art spaces have turned into. It essentially works at the level of tackling the reputation capital of art institutions, which, as discussed before, kind of covers the entire ground of their valuation via price. So although this is a valid form of activism, the pointing out and discrediting of prestige, but as is often mentioned, there's usually an issue with continuous maintenance of this model. So as we see with like the Whitney biennial activism, you do it once a year. It's almost like a ritual of, turning against Whitney annually, and then, you retreat back into your studio, and then a year later you come back for another demonstration. And it's something that's often posed at those modes of criticism that they're not functional. But secondly, I think this second point can be very easily manifested in terms of Goldsmiths itself as an institution. And someone was telling me the other day that, like, strangely enough, Goldsmiths' history of labor strikes and its political consciousness actually feeds back to Goldsmiths' reputation economy as an institution, which is a very attractor that brings in students and cash flow that's interested in this critical space. So in a way, how do you balance out this reputation capital not to strengthen the institution? So this takes me to the final part, the final project, which I'm not going to discuss as I'm a bit fragile about it still, but I'm kind of going to go over like the ideas around it and pass it on to Erik, who's actually a conversation partner and collaborator on this project so far with me. And that's called Weird Economies. It's a platform, as many projects are these days. And the subtitle is Betting Together. I'm not showing the slide anymore. So this third approach, that's at its very kind of initial stage of conception, there's another thinking around redistribution of means and infrastructural resources at place. And that thinking is oriented in an understanding of the transformation of labor markets into financial markets and the different forms of political engagement that each of these institutions require. In a way, what we describe the artist as piggy bank to be is essentially the prime example of this figure of the investee subject of the financial markets. And so in this last formulation, I'm trying to think of a way of not only enhancing contractual relations based on fair fees, which was the case with the art protocol, or counter speculation and discrediting of institutional prestige through re-education. That was part of the thinking with Bloch and Goldsmiths strikes and decolonized displays, each differently, but I would say there's a mutual ground there. But really it's about raising the credit worthiness and the attractiveness of projects that otherwise don't get a channel for investment. And so in a way, this proposal functions not in antagonism with the logic of financialization, but it tries to work with the given conditions of this financialized life. And it's a question of how we can upgrade our status as mere stakeholders to shareholders of these art spaces. And I mean, these questions sound very abstract, but I think it would be good kind of like things to put forward for the conversation later. So we can basically open a space of possibility for different forms of investment. Now we can say that something similar to this effect for art, at least, is taking place in the visual culture of image platforms today. And like from TikTok to Instagram, the meme production, the visual production, though it's a narrow field of art that leaves out maybe like many registers of performativity to sculptural practices, but I would argue that even performance emerges in platforms differently. There's a widening of the space of inclusivity, of course, that's happening there. And of course, it's where corporations and commercial businesses are weighing in to sponsor these forms of creativity. But I would say when it comes to contemporary art institutions as we know them, this is not the case, and they still embrace their cultural capital rather conservatively. And still very much the reputation derives from the personal bondages and the nepotistic web of friendships. It's not loosening it up itself to that form of the online platforming that's happening today. And this also relates to what I said earlier, that despite its claims to the post-internet space, contemporary arts economy is still very much embodied, and that's part of its pricing mechanisms. So I think especially, and I'm just going to end it here, given the fact that the post-pandemic situation is only going to make the prospects of public funding for art even more grim, among different methods of reorganizing money circulation in art, we have to basically convince private institutions of the creditworthiness of different projects and work at the level of distributing the reputation clout and ways of access to these resources that are there. And this might need a rethinking of the role of platforms, whether they can be recuperated or we can build them anew, because there's a lot of problems with platforms as we know them now. And we need to also work on the level of changing the definitions of what's bankable and what's not. And this is a primary concern for this web platform that I'm developing that's called Weird Economies, and it's going to be launched very soon. And a lot of people I know and I'm in conversation with is going to be part of. And just to end on this quote by Michel Fer in his book Rated Agency that was published last year, he says, investee activists should not only confront speculators in the very arena where endeavors of all kinds are securitized, but also join them in the psychic space where they make wagers. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Bahar, for your presentation and also like being the perfect bridge. And then also thank you, Luisa. I basically forgot to say this before. And yeah, the screen is Erik's, if I can, yeah.
Okay, so I guess it's my turn. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Yasamin and the whole Safari collective, System Safari. Very much looking forward to discover more what the system is about. I've met Bahar about a year ago, I mean, virtually, through my activities with Economic Space Agency, which is, I mean, a startup, more of a think tank, trying to take the question of economy as a design question. And I was organizing some event here in Berlin at Haus der Statistik, where Tirdad had invited me to. And we were working on digital socialism and trying to reopen the question of economic planning. And I think Tirdad suggested that I watch Bahar's film, After Scarcity. And I just loved it. And we've been in discussion ever since, basically. So I'm really, really happy to be part of the Weird Economies proposition. We've been thinking a lot about it. So I guess today I'm going to talk a little bit about that. What's this weirding about? I'm not an economist per se, definitely not a financier neither. But I've been interested in these issues for a couple of years now. And I guess my presentation will build on what Bahar has described, like this trajectory from contractual protocols or designing contractual protocols and then moving towards the design of incentives, or what the Economic Space Agency we used to call setting attractors for your own behaviors, or design of incentives for belonging in becoming types of practices. That would be my version, my Deleuzian tweak on it. So I guess I'm going to start with just reading this little philosophical poem that was published a few days ago by John Protevi. Because basically what I'm interested in discussing today and opening up for the discussion is the process of weirding itself. What do we mean by weirding economies? Engaging with the systemic aspect of it. I'm not going to talk about the systemic aspect of the art world per se, but I guess it's on everyone's mind somehow. And I guess, yeah, I could say I'm coming from a post-critical or let's say just like a Deleuzian or post-Deleuzian perspective. And so I'm going to start with this little poem because I find it fascinating for the way it suggests one of the key moves when we try to engage with what Bahar referred to before, when we start engaging with the psyche of the investors, or like engaging with financial capitalism, not just from the critical banks or the edges, but like really try to engage with the speculative aspect of it. So John Protevi produced a hash, a summary of anti-Oedipus. Anti-Oedipus has a very interesting theory of money, by the way. So he has produced this very short version that is made of words of one syllable. So I'm not going to read it all. I'm just going to read part 1 and part 3, but you will see how the question basically that I'm interested in discussing today, the question of value capturing, how we can maybe open up other ways of understanding what value capturing is about. So anti-Oedipus in words of one syllable starts like this. What is real is a flow and a break and a flow and a break and so on. You can cut off some flow to keep for you, and that is fun. But watch out, it can all break down, and if you will, just have a flow and no break. That is bad and not what we want. And then part 3, I forgot what's the title of the chapter in Anti-Oedipus, but it's the one about nomadism. So it goes like this: a tribe will scar your skin to mark a code on you, so you know what is your part of a flow and a break and a flow and a break, and so on. The king will want to make the code for a flow and a break and a flow and a break and so on be his code. Us now, we let the old code break down, and now we let a flow and a break and a flow and a break and so on run free. But we too have a code. Do what you want as long as you can make a cut in a flow and keep some. It is a hell of a way to run a code. You have to go to the moon and start a war and so on just to keep that code at work. So that, I find, is actually super suggestive. I guess among the many things that we tried at Economic Space Agency is to make a cut in the financial fabric and run a code for ourselves, and try to democratize finance so as to open up its code for others to make cuts in it. And it's a very, very hard thing to do. And it's not necessarily working in the ways that Economic Space Agency is doing it right now, but it's extremely stimulating to open up the question of what value is made of and its degree of speculation. And I mean, that's where it gets interesting to discuss art and economy together, and to not presuppose too much what economic values are made of. And that's also something that I appreciated in Bahar's presentation. Like, that's like to not presuppose what value is made of, so that we can maybe start opening the question up again from an artistic perspective, or maybe just more political. So I will read a little bit around, let me read just a little bit, because otherwise it's going to be a little bit complicated to really wrap my mind around all the elements that I would like to share with you. But basically, like, it's really a reflection around the weird economies and what it's involving, coming from the crypto economics side of things. So my interest in crypto economics stems from a sense of activist urgency. We need to undo business as usual. We need to destitute the economic forms that hold us captive and mesmerized. The devil, especially when it comes to economic matters, is in the details. That is to say, in the way business models fasten and secure their return on investment, and the type of episteme developed by finance. The latter can be prospectively called the financial art of non-knowledge, a term for grounding a key feature of financial derivative practices, the conversion of radical, unknowable uncertainty into manageable, that is, knowable risk. In Dark Ecology, Timothy Morton reminds us that the word weird comes from the Old Norse urth, meaning twisted in a loop. He invites us to develop a new kind of ecological awareness, something he calls an ecognosis, that challenges linear causality and opens up the aesthetic dimension, orienting us towards a dark and resonant place where myriad things loop themselves into existence. So I'm quoting Morton here. Ecological awareness is weird. It has a twisted looping form. Ecological awareness is a loop because human interference has a loop form, because ecological and biological systems are loops. And ultimately, this is because to exist at all is to assume the form of a loop. The loop form of being means we live in a universe of finitude and fragility, a world in which objects are suffused with and surrounded by mysterious clouds of unknowing. So he's quoting this medieval treaty called The Clouds of Unknowing here. So following this method of philosophical inquiry, insisting on the operational closure of things, this is like kind of an object-oriented perspective, let's say. We could characterize the economic mode of existence as a place where different types of organizations and business models loop themselves into existence. So business models weirdly capture value. They presuppose something like a planned return on investment. Something, therefore, that loops back onto itself for a profit. Most of these operations are, as Deleuze and Guattari rightfully pointed out in Anti-Oedipus, intrinsically unavowable. They happen in the shadows. They take part in the formation of the positive unconscious structuring social life under capitalism. So that part is kind of important, I would say, the weirding in capitalism, but I guess the weirding in general, like the way things loop themselves into existence, part of it is unknowable. Or I mean, I don't want to make too much of an ontological claim here, but it's difficult to access, and it's often informal, or as Deleuze and Guattari would put it, unavowable. And that's a huge question for us. If we're to design new forms of value production, new forms of value capture and exposure, how do we deal with that positive unconscious aspect of it? So financial capitalism uses monetization as a speculative looping mechanism by which social, cultural, and ecological values are flattened out and made economically equivalent with one another. Obviously, its extractive architecture is inherently hierarchical. The privileged few are allowed to issue money, while everyone else can issue promises to pay money. So as the great political economist Perry Merling reminds us, I quote, "The most real thing is money, but money is nothing more than a form of debt, which is to say a commitment to pay money at some time in the future. The whole system is therefore fundamentally circular and self-referential. There is nothing underneath, as it were, holding it up." So if we want to turn the whole world into a swarm of living commons rather than self-abstracting, devouring corporate entities, we need to engage further into how monetary systems and business models actually work. We need to make our economies weird again. We need to design otherwise types of feedback loops and modes of capture that escape the tight grip of reductive economic abstractions and anti-social storing of value. We often hear about how we live in a world of flows, a world made liquid, apparently smooth and easy. We talk about financial liquidity and even liquid democracy. The impression of frictionless movement depends on a planetary scale computational apparatus and governing architecture that Benjamin Bratton has recently defined as the stack. The speculative financial art of harnessing the futural flows and make them loop back in the present is an essential component of this megastructure. As Martin Koenig reminds us, I quote, "Capital's measures and calculations are performative devices. They play an active, constructive role in generating the very surplus value it is after." So this performative and speculative aspect of value capturing is crucial if we want to approach financial matters with a hacker spirit and a weirding poetics of experimentation. How do we transform the traditional modes of value capture and exposure embedded in the current economic infrastructures and reopen them for the benefit of the community? Or how do we convert economic loops into social and artistic flows and vice versa? So these are like the kind of like general questions or consideration that I share very closely with Bahar. Like she developed the concept of weird economies. I mean, without me knowing it. So it's really like I was working on the notion of ecognosis and the weird through Timothy Morton. But so that's really unexpected and serendipitous encounter. And if you want to formalize it a little bit more, the question of the looping or the weird can be thought of as a question of recursivity. The question of recursivity is really, really key for the actual encoding of value. I mean, if you think of algorithms, for instance, algorithms are recursive systems, or you might also just think of, I mean, a favorite example of mine these days is language, like the German language, more specifically, trying to learn German these days. And you have this weird grammar where the verb comes at the end. So there are all these jokes. There's one, I mean, it goes all the way back to Mark Twain, but you can go also to Douglas Hofstadter, who published a book called The Strange Loop, where he is giving the example of German language as an example of a recursive process, where basically a recursive process is a function that calls itself until a halting state is reached. So basically, if you use the German language as an example, you could imagine sentences and sentences, and you only put, you pronounce the verbs only at the end. So basically he's imagining this kind of like a cruel or torture seminar where you would have like an hour of explanation without verbs. And then in the last 15 minutes, the professor would just like list up the series of verbs that would allow for the stack of knowledge to actually be activated. So anyway, these are the weird, the geeky jokes that one encounters when trying to wrap one's mind around what is recursivity, what is contingency, to take up Yuquei's recent book, and start processing what other types of recursivities we could design in the value systems that we're part and parcels of. So that brings me to the question of art, more specifically, and without going too much into details. So here I'm thinking with Boris Groys, who posit that the contemporary artist is being engaged in a process of self-production, which manifests itself as a pure subjectivity, or what he calls the embodiment of a void, which is quite reminiscent to what Agamben defined many years ago as a subjectivity without content, the artist as a subjectivity without content. And I think that this question of the embodiment of a void could make the artist as a perfect candidate for becoming a living currency, or the art world or contemporary art, CA, as Sohail Malik describes it, as a place where new types of valuation are happening. But anyway, I'm not going to go into details here, but that's kind of the discussion that we're having with Bahar also, in terms of like, okay, when we engage with the question of pricing in the art world, but not necessarily only in the art world, what is it about exactly? And what's the role of art as a critical and post-critical practice in this regard? So in Boris Groys' work, artistic production is invariably presented as a practice of active demarcation that allows us to experience the internal or historical curvature of a world, something like its financial design. For the author of The Total Art of Stalinism, or Gesamtkunstwerk Stalin, artistic praxis is indiscernible from a more general political positioning that takes upon itself the responsibility of bioproduction and closure. So for if, I quote, in an open society, closure is predominantly administered by capital, end of quote, the task both of artists and thinkers is to break free from the bad infinite of economics and bring to the fore their own set of political delimitation and operational, if only partial, operational closures. And that's where I see the interest in trying to work with the platform as a forum. For instance, bouncing on what Luisa was presenting earlier on as well. So if we engage a little bit further, and this time from the perspective of cryptoeconomics, or what cryptoeconomics makes possible, that allows us to maybe go a little bit deeper into the question of value capturing. So I like this quote from a group of very young people that I've met while we were based in Oakland, in the Bay Area, with the Economic Space Agency. So we ran into these very young people that are really well read and had like discovered Nickland from whatever means, and they call themselves their Reddit page, The Sorcery of the Spectacle. And I think that they capture pretty much one essential component of what cryptoeconomics is about. They've been collaborating with us, Economic Space Agency. They also collaborated with Holochain. So anyway, they say capitalism only hangs on because it is the most secure way of securing value inside a container. So whatever comes after capitalism would simply be more of that. The only thing that can defeat capitalism is an even more secure way of securing value inside a container that is even more capitalist. So that reads maybe a little bit as a provocation, but it's also for me like maybe the best introduction to what cryptoeconomics is about. Because if you want to discuss cryptoeconomics seriously, you need to engage with the coding itself. And the coding is really all about making containers as safe as possible so that they're not hackable, so that you can store value of any kind. So there's this kind of like constant speculation of what would happen if we would own our own means of encoding, our own means of encryption. Then the challenge is to not stay stuck within that kind of limited fetishism of the value form in its most contained understanding, and start thinking like in the informalization perhaps of the value form, or like try to open up that threshold of the formalization and the informalization of the value form, and not stay cut. I mean, if you want to engage fully with this vision of the containment of value, Bitcoin is doing just fine. Like Bitcoin has been conceived of as a digital gold. That's what the narrative is about, and it's about value maximalism. That is like a deflationary value form, so a form that can only gain value in time because of its digital or artificial scarcity. I don't think there's any progressive politics to be done with that. It gives you ideas about how to challenge capitalism, maybe, but it's not where I would suggest our inquiry to be going. But still, like if we're to discuss about the weirding itself, the way things loop themselves into existence, you need to be appreciative, I would say, of the way Bitcoin was able to loop itself into existence in a very tight and suggestive way, let's say. So distributed ledger technologies are most often associated with cryptocurrencies, but it's perhaps more interesting to conceive of them first as constitutional or institutional orders, a set of protocols by which individuals or firms or algorithms can make economic and political exchanges. In this sense, blockchains look a lot like jurisdictions or virtual countries. And just like countries, blockchain have systems of governance, usually open source protocols which define how individuals interact and transact with one another. So DLT, distributed ledger technologies, have triggered an age of experiment in online collective formations, a sort of cooperative renaissance of the web for the exploration of new ways to achieve consensus in digital ecosystems. The hope is that blockchain technology, through cryptographic consensus, provides a technical solution to the problem of trust and cooperation in large-scale digital collectives. Ultimately, what is often called the Internet of Value would allow for the creation of new forms of collective fractal ownership and communal asset sharing through different tokenized wrappings. So, and that's where the idea of a platform also is radically opened up. Because if you have a platform in which you can start generating these new forms of tokenization / wrapping of new forms of sociality, then maybe something else happens. Maybe you start entering that space that Michel Ferrer called the psyche of the investing logic, or what Randy Martin calls the social logic of the derivative, because it's not only about what overflows. Like basically, I guess the two main coordinates of my thinking here is that on the one hand, we need to learn to take seriously the question of value capturing. And then what I guess I would like to discuss more perhaps is how we are accounting for all that is deriving, all that is overflowing, which is actually where the value is. Value is not just in its capture, it's in the way it propels itself through different types of momentum. And that is something that the art world, the positive unconscious of the art world, is very, very much attuned with through whatever, the prestige economy, or however the valuations that we're constantly engaged in are happening faster than we even critically reckon with. So that's also interesting, I think, to conceive of value in these terms as, let's say, as a constitution of or assembling of active forces, because it makes you, it makes us question the criticality of the art world itself and the way it self-propels critically. But that's maybe something we can discuss later as well. So let me finish with, so when I was preparing for this call, I started having some new intuitions about this whole thing of the value capturing, but basically in the world of startups, in the crypto space, the ultimate token, basically, I mean, that's not how people discuss it, but the ultimate token is communities. Everyone, and the more people are talking about communities these days, the more you can be sure that they're participating in some sort of capitalist logic. I mean, that's really what's happening. Like, we're way past any kind of post-Heideggerian coming community type of discussion. You know, it's really all about how you blend your community with the production so that they become seamless, so that you have producers and consumers that are totally, and the feedback loop between the producers and the consumers is totally integrated and immanent. And then you're part of these new digital tribes, you know, that produce value for themselves and signal their pride in being part of these communities, which is like a total defacing of the word community. Like, if I mean, we want to take it seriously. So basically, this whole idea of value capturing through the reclaiming of the word community, the beautiful word of community, forces us, I would say, or at least that's where I am at, to reopen the question of the co-immunity. Co-immunity as a way to engage with how, like the nuts and bolts of how this value recognition, value capturing and exchange happens within actual communities. Let's say a distinctive or a discrete and distinctive understanding of what matters in the derivative socialities that we're engaged in, often without even knowing. You know, it's a constant process of value discovering that we're part of, ideally. And that these are the questions that I'm kind of more interested in these days. So, like, from community as the new token to co-immunity as something that would be more actively engaged in, that would perhaps protect us from the traditional value capturing devices that we see at play in the art world, but I mean also way beyond it. So the distinction between digital communities and the organization of value capture and exposure is increasingly blurring. A good example of this phenomenon is the way a new generation of artists is getting involved in the blockchain space and are generating companies and other cooperative endeavors with an artistic tool set. Art here suggests both the generative informality of social life and the process of discovering new ways of formalizing sociality. The way art preserves and exposes its own ambiguity, basically, or the way it presents the puzzling, as Abbas would put it. Or again, if I quote Hito Steyl in her excellent piece that I constantly go back to, "If you don't have bread, eat art, contemporary art and derivative fascism." So she writes, "Art is encryption as such, regardless of the existence of a message with a multitude of conflicting and often useless keys. Art as currency gains its relative stability because of non-transparency, because of its overwhelming reliance on human relations." So what is at stake here from a crypto financial perspective is the process of incorporation proper, that is the corporatization, that which eventually enclose and ensure the stable value of a said economic asset. The possibility introduced by blockchain-based economies is that tokens with governance rights could represent a new kind of asset class, a new form of value. In this perspective, crypto network governance with its associated data asset would become a new form of capital. And that's what basically at Economic Space Agency we call an economic space, which is basically the organization of risking and speculating together within given parameters or following given protocol for interaction. And I mean, there's a lot that could be said here, but basically the tropism that is overwhelming or over-determining the crypto economic space is that you run into people that really fetishize or fantasize automation. So this idea of having protocols for interaction that can secure value is just, that's where the most of the speculation goes towards. That's where the financing from venture capitals also comes in, of course. And that's also where it becomes problematic, not because of venture capitalism per se. I mean, I'm really like, I mean, after 4 years in the space, I'm really open to pretty much anything. The problem is more that it doesn't work. You can't formalize, like the whole art is to be able to have this sweet spot between the informalization and the formalization. And that's where I would say value can be generated at this like crypto, financial and art world threshold or point of encounter. And that requires, if I put it a little bit, push it a little bit further, that's the discussions we're into with Bahar, maybe moving from an attention economy to something like ecologies of attention. Ecologies of attention then presupposing less of an individual with a given attention capacity, but something that's more ecological in the way that we co-define attentionscapes. And that would be part of what I'm working on in terms of a cosmo-financial proposal that is building on the work of Bruno Latour, Isabelle Stengers. I used to study with Isabelle Stengers. I'm very committed to the idea of cosmopolitics. So basically, when we start imagining an art world as a paradigm for a coming economy, so an art world made of a myriad of robust practices that are not necessarily fluent into one another's language, but still participate somehow into some abstract art world. So basically, how can we conceive of art practices or practices more generally as worlds, as cosmo? And the cosmo in cosmo-financial, or the cosmo in cosmopolitics, kind of foregrounds the idea that you don't know what a world is made of. That's really important. Like, that's really the basis of the cosmopolitical proposition. And basically, if you bring it to the cosmo-financial, so the cosmo-financial proposal, then is the idea that you engage with other worlds as unknowns that are in constant process of discovery. So it's a value discovery process in the most basic financial term. It's just that maybe we can reappropriate what value discovery is about and make it happen otherwise. Open it up, weirding it in different ways, make it an occasion for what I like to call proof of celebration. So like fully ritualize the process of value discovery. And this is all in the idea of slowing down the process of value discovery, which goes against the primordial function of financial markets, which is to create commensurations between different values and produce a maximum liquidity. So basically, the kind of quadrature of the circle here is to be able to generate our own way of generating liquidity for ourselves like as kind of like remnants of autonomous politics in me. And at the same time, basically, I think strategically figure out ways to shelter ourselves from the way actual financial markets are generating liquidity on our backs. So that, yeah, that's where I would leave it.
Sounds great, thank you, Erik. I just think like we are kind of like running late with the time and everything. So yeah, I have to kind of like cut it at this point. But then, yeah, it would be great if we can open up a conversation and discussion between you guys, and then after that we take questions from people basically here or on YouTube or everywhere else that you want to send us questions. We're gonna just like echo them here, and if you want to ask a question, just put pluses in the chat box, and then we can have your video and sound as well for that. Yeah. If I just want to kind of like maybe ask a very broad question, that would be around this idea of platforms, channeling platforms through contemporary art and this whole stuff that was going on in the three of your discussions, and basically like to see how that would work beyond the art world, how that goes beyond the circuits of art world as a starting point.
I can just give a brief answer. I mean, first of all, platforms is kind of a recent like its introduction to the art world is quite recent. It didn't actually originate from there. But one thing is, I think these words are usually used quite like interchangeably, but they're not actually the same. Infrastructure versus platform versus systems. And platforms very specifically, by definition, are vague. And this is something that I'm writing on throughout my PhD, which is that ambiguity is actually something that connects with the indeterminacy that we think of as contemporary art. And then like it's the question of whether that indeterminacy of the kind of the ontological ambiguity of the platform can be, you know, accessed differently. But basically platforms are that kind of like thinking of, you know, Bill Clinton and the you know, the third ways in the UK, you can think of them basically as that kind of interface between the stockholders and the shareholders. And that's kind of the embedded ambiguity is actually placed there because they're trying to please the shareholders as they please their stockholders, which is their employers and their users. So it's a form of kind of like, you know, linguistic play that basically at the end of the day is supposed to please everyone. So I think just like, you know, there's so many ways of like being clear with these terms because it helps like locating like the conversation around platforms because yeah, it's used kind of very loosely in the art scene these days too. So I'm not sure that, you know, what we talk about with Erik, like I'm not sure what I'm doing is still called the platform or the weird economies is the platform. It's still up for conversation.
Yeah, I guess what I could add or how I could jump in that is that in even a more simple way for me, like this idea that Bahar is bringing up the stakeholders and the shareholders and the ambiguity. It's where for me the idea of platform works very well to kind of push for these hidden agendas because you can actually manipulate who, like this idea of like everyone is getting satisfied. So who is the user? What is the output? Who are the like you can actually manipulate these terms as an artistic practice, but also as a strategic practice. And that for me is actually quite interesting. So that's why when I propose, it's kind of like this layering, like when I propose like the artwork as a platform is to kind of like have a hidden agenda within the infrastructure, which can then create kind of a model, which can, you know, like, and then these terms go like, they start being embedded in one another, not interchangeable, but embedded in one another. So the idea of the ambiguity of the platform, it's definitely something that it's very helpful to manipulate our agendas if we want to kind of experiment or push for different kind of systems.
I think something wasn't clear about that we are now open to questions from anyone, not just the speaker. So if anyone has questions or points to make, notes, that would be great.
Yeah, I suppose, can you hear me? I could come in here, I suppose, to sort of follow on from that. I think that's really interesting, the idea of a platform being a means towards sort of messing with a system and the role that those platforms play, which I think came across with all your talks. But also what really came across to me was the idea of rewiring or the recoding, and in Luisa's work, especially the kind of siphoning off of money from the art world to then go beyond the constraints. So you've got the solar panels that's sort of channeled through the cryptocurrency that then ultimately goes to beyond people in communities, way beyond the art world. And then also in kind of Bahar's work of designing these, you know, the weird, what's it called?
Weird economies.
Weird economies, exactly. So by creating, kind of describing new systems or new platforms, or creating a kind of virtual or actual platform, new groupings, then you can kind of take ideas into new places, and also, and with that, money and that sort of thing. So I was wondering if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, comment. One thing, like for me, one thing that becomes very clear being from Brazil, but I'm like, that's not exactly like a location issue. It's also located within this like global interconnected art world, but also like, it's almost like these two locations are together, but also from Brazil, is how when we talk about finance and when we talk about value producing within the art world and production and resources, how that is very much tied to everything which is outside of art. So the incentives, the funding, the legal fundings, the private fundings, the private actors, the culture of labor within the cities and etc. So there's so much outside of the world of art that informs art and this production that we like usually we ignore, and we kind of just start locating within ourselves and within our discussions that. And then this, of course, because of that, the solutions or the propositions or the criticality that we build only informs the art world and doesn't inform back, doesn't feed back or doesn't loop back, as Erik was saying, to this broader overarching system. And this relationship is something that we can literally not afford. Like, it's kind of not pun intended, like we cannot afford anymore, because not only with like the COVID crisis now, but with the recession that is going to come forward in the next few months and years, this is going to definitely cut through the economics of art. So that for me, it's super important to kind of interconnect and understand, and also why it's extremely important to locate. And I want to stress this a bit. I very much like the image that Benjamin created of the accidental megastructure. And I kind of use it in a hack way to kind of explain the idea of the infrastructures of art, which is, is not an equivalent mirror of how Benjamin uses. It's just, for me, a didactic way of putting forward this different layerings of infrastructure. Like, for example, we were discussing here the friendship and affective relationships, or the legal frameworks, or the democratic spatial infrastructure, if a city has more public or privatized spaces, etc. And when you start of kind of creating a descriptive model of this contemporary art megastructure, what exactly are there, what exactly are the laws, the incentives, etc., you can actually start thinking in a broader sense, and not only thinking on contracts, on how am I as a single artist is going to get paid, but how you can, for example, harness institutions to actually try to push back into a legal framework. And not only I'm not sure if I'm being clear, but I think my point is, in looking outside of art and outside of just this closed system of economic value, you can actually start pushing out or up. I don't know, I'm disoriented right now, but you can actually start pushing out and trying to leverage these other infrastructures. So the democratization of space, or the legislation of funding incentives, or taxation, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, actually, just maybe kind of relating to that, one thing that I picked up on at the very start of your talk, Luisa, and I think that this is kind of an interesting tension that's going on with some of this, is possibly the tension between what it would mean to plan or model a kind of culture, right? Which seems to be the nature of the project, is in some sense to see culture and interventions into culture as a modelable kind of endeavor. And at the same time, then this kind of like conception of culture as a kind of free-flowing thing, which necessitates that the rules are not made explicit from the outset, in the sense that in order to, culture has this kind of like emergent dimension, and is understood in some sense to not be graspable as an object, right? So it's a kind of a becoming, right? It's kind of got this, I guess, like Erik brought up, like Deleuze and Guattari, and it's got this kind of like flowing kind of dimension or character, which would suggest that then it couldn't be described in that sense of like, you couldn't point to a culture, or you couldn't, but I think that there is, I think that this is a tension. I don't think that, because I seem to feel like I agree with both sides in some sense, and maybe like trying to describe that in more, or like work through that in some more detail might be a way of resolving that tension. I don't know, or do other people see that tension as existing or not? I don't know if I've asked it in necessarily a clear way, but that was just one thought, I guess.
Yeah, I'm trying to kind of grasp what you were saying. I'm going to try to mirror it back to you, so maybe you can kind of correct me if I got it right or wrong. But I guess what you're saying is like this tension between culture being this thing that it kind of emerges and you cannot point at, and I think Erik used a very specific word that I'm not going to be able to repeat because I don't think I noted it down to talk about that, but like this ungraspable nature of culture. And I was actually proposing that culture is kind of this object that must be designed, is like this tension that you're mentioning, right? Yeah, I think, it's a tension that definitely exists, I guess, but at least for me, it's very much about, it's very much like it relates to the tension that it's tied to the way you set the conditions for culture to happen. You also are setting the culture that it's going to happen, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like once, like, like a very maybe graspable example is this idea of the independent or the marginal that gets like, we don't have marginal anymore. We don't have independent, also because of these huge platforms. They kind of feed on the idea of exclusivity or you're different and etc. So the idea of the emergent and singular character of culture is also kind of being solved by a broader neoliberal take. So maybe a way to kind of like, I don't know, have a take on that is actually trying to design it in a way that embedded this already, or like recursively already understands that it's not going to just emergently rise a new kind of punk hacking culture that we can then leverage on. We kind of have to like understand where that would fit and how to build that.
I think for me, the question is still one of like, accepting all of that, then there are like challenges of authorship, I guess. I think somebody else had a question or a point that they wanted to make, so maybe I'll stop talking and
Samana, do you want to go on? If you also want to turn on your camera.
I can go on. I don't know how to turn on my camera though, to be honest. It's not really working, but you can hear me, no?
Yes, we can, yeah.
So I'm quite new to this idea of platforms, and it was really interesting to hear your the way that you conceptualize it. And I guess the question that I had was about the relationship, like how do you understand platforms in relation to scales? Are they, is scale something that has to do with size? I mean, do we get platforms that are just too large to be operative? Or do we understand that as platforms as something that operates in a kind of like a multi-scalar way, or an interscalar way, you know, because they're kind of like structurally, they're quite different in the way that they work. And then, you know, like what if we talk not just about one platform, but a lot of them? How do we understand the relation between different scales of platforms? Are they hierarchical? What are the kind of like the ways that they relate to one another? Are they kind of like a Russian doll? Like, I don't know. I just wanted to learn more about it.
I just wanted to add like a short thing. I totally agree. Like, this is a question for me as well in terms of when initiating a practice, how does the scale of that, when it's general abstract sort of like planning, how does it maybe connect to the like smaller scale or to the locale or anything in that sense? It's probably not even like, it might be less about a scale, but about connection or interconnectedness between the two ends of this thing. But yeah, just to...
I can just give my own answer quickly. But I think, again, there are many definitions. It's basically a very recently conceptualized, theorized object. And it's mostly, I mean, the conceptualization comes from practice, but you can think about it in a way as an interface between infrastructural levels. So it's not necessarily, it's not necessarily like, it doesn't start from the question of scale. It more so starts from the question of what's the project. So it scales itself to the demands of the project. And of course, like if you have a large scale platform like Amazon, it's the prime example of, you know, platforms. That's where you get ultimate power, because you get the biggest kind of interface within an economy. And then like the platform itself becomes its own market. So this is eventually the end goal with platforms. So you can kind of construct your own market and don't participate in the competitive, you know, other markets that exist. And in terms of hierarchy, yeah, of course, again, same as the Amazon example, like even within the, you know, most luxurious, like, you know, expensive platforms, there's hierarchies of scale. But then it's basically like based on how you want to kind of define this interfacing project. You know, you can have it as small as possible. That's how, you know, like the startup culture functions these days, as Erik is more familiar with, of course. But working with 5 people around the project, sometimes it's easier than, you know, working with 1 million people. But then if you're constructing a market, then you need 1 million people on your platform.
I guess I could also just add that it's kind of interesting to note that in terms of scale, like platforms also, when you think of Amazon or when you think of Spotify, etc., like because they are this interface, they create this, they become monopolies as well of the situation that they are interfacing. because they start creating path dependencies and network effects. So in a way, it's like, it's not exactly about scale, but there is this idea of monopoly of monopoly that it can be related to scale in my view. So I think it's kind of an interesting thing to note.
It's maybe like going back to Amazon, isn't it? Like Amazon needs more people on the platform, but then not everyone on the platform is getting like equal access to the platform. It's only like because you have more people as Amazon gets stronger. So around the million people on the platform thing.
Can you say the question again, actually?
Oh, it was less of a question, more of just a point. Yeah.
Maybe there's a tension between the platforms that we know that mostly offer services and what Geert Lovink and Ned Rossiter called network with consequences. I don't know, that's something that I would maybe suggest in trying to open up a little bit what type of other types of platforms could be imagined. Or otherwise, there's this whole movement of platform co-ops that basically like allow for the stakeholders to have access to the nuts and bolts of the programming of the platform itself. So like a co-op that would do the work that Uber is doing right now, for instance. But otherwise, for let's say for weird economies, or for what I guess we would need to figure out if it's a service that is proposed by the platform, and if not, then maybe it's an entry point for a reflection on the type of networks that we are engaged in, that we know that are generating value, and yeah, it's open because yeah, the platform as an object, as a form isn't yeah, it's complicated.
Because I guess also there's a difference between the scale of a platform as this kind of like interface where all of kind of like these interactions are happening, and the scale of the platform in the kind of like larger sense, as you say, the kind of like the effect of it, the kind of like the what is like, you know, the kind of like the unexpected of it, the things that are outside of it, but it comes to influence and change, and in a way maybe like, you know, like you could have scales of platforms that are quite the platform itself is quite small, but then, you know, like there's or vice versa, that the actual, like, you know, nothing actually happens outside of it, but the itself is quite kind of like larger.
I mean, I'm gonna kind of go against what I said earlier, that you know, people use it interchangeably, but there is a condition that we can say platforms and infrastructures are actually becoming more convoluted in terms of platforms becoming infrastructures and infrastructures becoming platforms. And a good example of it is Google Maps. So the GPS system on Google Maps, you can think about it as a platform then that kind of like slowly, you know, takes over the kind of, you know, the idea of like a global mapping, and it gives some kind of like infrastructural necessity to engage with Google Maps if you want to find an address. And yeah, Google in general, so the search engine is like a, you know, life necessity these days. If you don't have the Google search engine, you're basically, you know, just lost. So these two, you know, these two concepts kind of like at this point, and this is what's happening basically, and that's also like Michel Serres and many other people's proposition, that we have moved into platform economies from the market model, from, you know, the state model. So this is a third condition, which is the platform model. Where most of our kind of, you know, daily life necessities take shape, at least in the West, let's say.
I could add something there, which I think what's really one of the really interesting things is the relationship between all these platforms and then the systems that they're part of, you know, and in a way, so thinking of this example of Google Maps, so there is the platform, that's the kind of service, and then obviously that's also a service, it's also a kind of network, it's also this kind of way that we navigate the world, but then that's part of a much greater system, and then what is that doing? So I think it is quite interesting, this relationship between the two, and they kind of sometimes almost swap places, and where is the power, and where, you know, where is the data, at what point is the data being extracted, at what point it's being fed in and taken out, which perhaps also then links back to this idea of the loops again. So data flows, you know, always in many different directions, and perhaps platforms suck in more data and systems use them, I don't know, but I think it's an interesting, just even thinking about the three presentations here, I think they're all different ways of talking about this, so there isn't a clear answer, and I think we're all entangled in different ways through that.
And if I can quickly add just yet another kind of fold into that, there's also the issue that some kinds of platforms, the way that they actually create or capture value is becoming this kind of spatial infrastructure. So it's actually through rent, like they're renting things that weren't rent before. So this is easy if you think on these other kinds of platforms such as Airbnb or WeWork, Uber, for example. So they are renting an infrastructure that was already in place where there wasn't before. So it's yet another way to kind of think on how to capture value through this interface.
I mean, I think that actually sheds light on something. I mean, it might be kind of going, it's sort of related to the discussion, but maybe I'll just say it. Like, there's something about the fact that a lot of adding value to different things that already exist as a kind of commons doesn't need to invent those new things themselves. So like Airbnb, for example, does not invent property, it merely adds value to property and homes and housing and so on. Yet I feel like a lot of the time when art tries to realize some kinds of similar counter economies, it also feels itself necessary to like invent the kind of conditions or invent something new, invent some new kind of an object. Or at least this isn't true of like all art, obviously, and I think it's not true of you know, a lot of different kind of interventions like that you know, a number of people are doing, including people here. But also I think it is true of a lot of maybe social practice type interventions, which, you know, kind of cleave more to a traditional understanding of art as needing to produce an object or produce a kind of artifact, or, you know, kind of produce something that is not simply repurposing what already exists. And I think maybe this ties to some of what we've been doing in this project. And the idea of system safari, it's supposed to be a sort of tongue-in-cheek thing of like, in fact, you know, to go on a system safari is to like pretend that you're somehow standing outside of the things that you're looking at whilst you're actually still within it, right? And there's no actual separation, but it's just a thing that sometimes art thinks about itself as doing, right? Or it's a subjectivity that is reflected back to art by the kind of interventions that it makes into different kinds of spaces that could be called platforms or systems. So yeah, I think just I don't know where that was going somewhere, and I forgot because it's been a long day. But yeah, I don't know if like people can speak to that or are interested. I mean, anyone can chime in. I hope that's clear. Just say something if you want.
I mean, on that note, I'm going to bring up something. It's also very unframed, the same as yours. It's going to be very like all over the place. But I was also like going back about value and credit that institutions are producing, and in this sense, like critical art institutions. I'm not necessarily like sure if that's the case right now, and still with basically art institutions guaranteeing that future value for the person or like through the network, because I guess like it's also in line with a neo-feudal term, in a sense, that your sort of like, in this sense, the educational institution doesn't necessarily guarantee or support the person getting higher in the system, or getting more access in the system, getting a bigger node. Which is, yeah, I'm thinking about that as well. But probably it's not even doing that thing anymore. Or like the credit system, like value production system, has been in a way shattered. So yeah.
I mean, I think this is also a point where art confronts the limitations of its own power, right? Because in a sense, what still gives power for different companies to sort of make enunciative claims over something that already exists is capital, right? And for as much funding as there is, which, you know, there isn't very much, but, you know, this is kind of also maybe a difficulty with, for me, with some of these, some projects, and I guess I'm trying to be a bit provocative here as well, is that they never are given enough resources to be able to make a significant dent, right? And anytime you get funding from an art institution or so on, and so on, it's always to make a piece of art which is almost necessarily not to be able to make a meaningful dent into the kind of systems you're trying to operate, beyond the kind of aesthetic, which I guess for art makes sense, right? And they can justify it as such, but this maybe marks like a limit point of arts intervention that we need to try and think around or surpass in some way, because it seems so intimately connected to capital, right? Still, the way in which value claims are made over collective or over a common, you know, a commons, it's still connected in some way to power. I don't know, maybe someone doesn't agree, but I don't know.
I think this is where there was a question earlier too that I kind of wanted to bring it here, but like I think that's distinction I was making between block and how we're thinking of the question of continuous maintenance with block, as in we need a continuous revenue, so that revenue is gonna keep the project going, versus because like it actually didn't happen, by the way, because it needs like more revenue than the work needed. So it's pretty much dormant, versus you know, what I'm trying to kind of define with this last, like the third term, which is thinking of the reputation economy and thinking of the speculative markets. It's actually something that's, you know, the betting in the speculative markets is happening by the second. And that's a very different mode of, like, you know, thinking about time continuity than like, you know, elections or you know, working on a project with a revenue and like getting gigs and blah blah. So really the question is like the sustenance of that credit, or like the investors, you know, coming investment. So, and these are all, like, for me, it's still very abstracted, but I think I kind of want to propose this other term in art, which is, and I think, like, I wanted to have this as a question for everyone also. What would be like a, you know, a way of designing this continuous investment, like where we can bring this investment from? Like, is it possible?
I wanted to bring back this, you know, this idea of the investment and the friendship that you were talking about and things like that, Bahar, and how that kind of relates to so much the economies, and how almost just before all this COVID thing happens, it was almost that everything had to be an investment. So turning up to a private view or whatever you were doing, there had to be something that came back. So perhaps that's also where, you know, there's definitely space now in what's happening for these kind of expectations to be shifted. And perhaps that is through, you know, these kind of, and well, in the case of the projects we've seen, that, you know, there are definitely ways that through kind of rewriting code or rewriting kind of tradition, the way things are done, that's where kind of the change can ripple outwards in many different directions. And in a way, I suppose, I mean, we haven't mentioned the pandemic at all in this, and that's just been assumed, and that's obviously what we're all suffering wherever we are. But thinking about the systems that is disrupting, and the platforms that we are having to learn to use and creating as well in response to it, and the architectures that we can kind of contribute to building, is perhaps also a way to sort of think forwards out of this as well, about speculatively turning into something more concrete from where we are.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is also quite interesting, Bahar, just because I think it commits us automatically also to this, and similarly, Ellie, to it kind of commits us to this MC M prime sort of model, right? Like if we can't somehow expect, as art has traditionally expected, to have a patron for these projects, that would be, that would give us enough without us needing to sort of somehow convert that into further capital and grow it somehow as a kind of economic instrument to make a meaningful dent, then it seems like, we need to already commit to the kind of logics that we're, but, and I'm not sure that we necessarily, that it needs to be conceived in such black and white terms, but I think this is a problem, right? Like that we are, like, I mean, this is a problem that friends of mine, even in co-ops, have had, right? Who, completely unrelated to art, they get money from the state, and it's all about this kind of, and it's good praxis to extract money from like earmarked funds and so on, and contribute that to social projects. But again, at a certain point you start, in order to overcome the conditions of the possibility of that, which is the state, then you necessarily need to grow by capital, given the kind of system of governance or administration that we need to like operate under. So like that seems like it becomes a limit point again, that there's a question of how it can be overcome, whether it can be overcome.
Exactly, in that point, I also have my doubts around this interruption, or basically, like as Luisa also said, this punk activism approach around systems or financial models, markets, and how that can be operative in real terms beyond like going from smaller scales. But then also like, I kind of like think of self-governance or like organizations or governance methods or forms. And then that's maybe something to think of. Although like, I don't know how that can get bigger or more general, that can also like kind of respond to broader situations or conditions in a way. So yeah. Also like something else that was interesting for me, it was within Erik's bio and the talk that we had before this session around the precarious and like precarity in the precarious person, as I call it, like the self-disciplined precarious artist. And I don't know like how we're looking at that. Maybe Erik, if you want to add on that in any way.
The whole discussion around the funding, if it's state-based, if it's private, like, I mean, it changes from one country to another depending on the conditions. I guess part of the interest for me to engage with financial categories, like I like what Bahar quoted from Michel Ferrer. Like if we start learning the rules by which, like basically financiers is a club of people that have decided to risk and speculate together. They are clearly privileged in doing so, but there is also a part where they're assuming what they call in their own jargon risk, and they're pushing risk on everyone else. So there is a place where I think we need to do a few translations for ourselves. Yasmin, that's because you're asking me about the precariat. So I mean, for many years it was describing, I guess that, I mean, it still describes the situation that most of us are in, like no doubt. I guess the interest of engaging with financial grammar is to start shifting the understanding of what precarity is about, and starting maybe turn it into a more offensive posture. And then maybe finance can give us a few ideas about how to turn it into a more offensive stance. Yeah, that'd be a general consideration about how we've politicized the condition of artists, and not just artists. I mean, any cultural worker. Precariat, when you say that word in the US, people don't know what precarity is. It's actually, you find it to be a word that is very connoted, much more connoted that at least in French, it's kind of like assumed that people know what precarity is about. My experience in the Bay Area is when we were talking about precarity, there was like almost like such a strong neoliberal mindscape that would, like, you would need to explain what precarity is about, and then something of, oh, but well, it's an occasion, it's an opportunity for taking risk, and ta-da-da. It's very interesting how the condition that we're in, how we describe it, and how we can maybe shift some of the parameters to make it, I mean, maybe to experiment something else.
I mean, also to add to that, you know, private versus public funding and the distinctions between countries, I think the very fact of that distinction shows that to some states, you still need to find an attractor for the state. So the state, in a way, still functions very similar to a museum. You need to convince it that this is a valuable asset to its inventory, to promote it and to fund it. And like I said, I mean, very briefly, like, I think I mean, it's quite obvious the post-pandemic situation is really grim for public funding in art. It's, if there's going to be any space that they would cut the fundings, as it's already happening in the UK to a certain extent, that's the least kind of promoted of the precariat and the least supported are the art gig workers. So we have to kind of like reconsider that space of public funding also, like in a more, you know, practical sense.
I think we had this conversation around Goldsmiths going to disappear, or like similar institutions, as a loose conversation around institutions, the situation that we have right now. Basically, the new title of this talk, "The Institution Never Dies," came from that point. So, I mean, I don't know if, yes, Suhail wants to kind of like intervene in this case, to see like if, yeah, if the institution is going to die or not, but then, yeah.
Is he there, or he's not even listening?
I think it's just a name without listening, or just imposter, but maybe can someone sort of like take on the position, imagining his response.
That's how people are exposed on Zoom seminars.
Yeah, yeah.
We should just call them out.
The trick is to kind of like put a phone with your image where the camera is. So like, yeah, it has your image, but then you're not there to forge the presence, basically.
I mean, I don't think anyone can say with any certainty, right? It's going to be a real sort of like, you know, circumstantial decision where it's clear that institutions like Goldsmiths will need to be bailed out in some form or another. Like, they're not going to survive of their own accord, because the very logic that underpins their functioning is like one which is completely susceptible to like, you know, fail in these kinds of conditions. You know, like universities don't exist, they can't run a profit because they're not turning over like, as you know, as much as they're giving, but they're supposed to have like kind of social value or so on. This is the kind of value that they're creating. It's kind of in many ways non-economic, even though there obviously are ways to make it kind of, to financialize it or whatever. But yeah, basically it seems like, and this is kind of maybe where the state still is relevant, it's a question of like, you know, whether it is deemed to be important by national governments ultimately will be the deciding factor. Or, well, I guess that's not entirely true, because actually a lot of the way that Goldsmiths exists is a kind of consequence of investment as well. But what underwrites that investment is also the state's kind of reassurance that, you know, I mean, in the specific case of the UK at least, the kind of the state underwriting or the guaranteeing of like art and cultural institutions by the state is kind of what kind of makes it more like worthwhile for people to invest in it, I guess, or at least that's my understanding of it. So yeah. And am I optimistic given that those are the conditions? No, but you know, Goldsmiths might be okay, and a lot of smaller art colleges actually won't be, and that's the bigger issue, right? Like, because Goldsmiths has a name and a reputation, it'll be the kind of like flagship, it'll be the one that's worth saving for a state or for the government. But there's going to be a lot of less sort of like prestigious or reputationally sound or, you know, proven institutions that will be kind of sacrificed in order to, you know, to kind of allow Goldsmiths to continue to exist or something. I think that would be my you know, but I've got no crystal ball either. So
yeah, honestly, I mean, I do get the reputation part, but I'm not sure about how that's actually generating other values, like in terms of market, as we've seen loads of times right now. The diagrams show that a person who has the MFA from Goldsmiths maybe just earns £200 more than the person who doesn't have the MFA. So basically it's not translating into very direct form of value, like financial value in any sense. And that goes with the new photo thing that I was basically thinking about before that. It's that even if you have access to the institution or the credit or reputation that the institution is supposed to give you, it's not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to get to that point, or that is going to turn into like actual situation. Maybe that's just basically the future promise or future speculation as similar to financial market of this institution, but then it doesn't come true in a sense.
Yeah, just to add to that, coming from a very precarious already country and city, institutions, like, they will definitely die, you know, like they can die and they will die. And I think what was pointed before is the most worrisome part is actually that this dying out of the institutional sphere or the educational sphere, and even of like the off spaces, smaller spaces, independent sphere, will actually give this very arid context for art, which at some point was actually the situation in Brazil, even in like the big city centers, where the context, the art context, is completely ruled by the commercial side, the commercial galleries and art fairs, etc. Even if the art fairs will also be extremely affected and are already being affected by the COVID crisis, because their logic is different, because their logic is of this logic of investment and profit and commoditization of the object, they will probably be like the reminiscence of the context. And it's a very complicated situation to kind of crawl out of once you have that. Talking from experience here in Rio, like it's very complicated to build back an institutional or educational sphere once you lose it. So I'm not optimistic at all. Sorry.
Someone on YouTube just has written that we all seem quite down today. Just thought to transfer the message here.
Yeah, fair. I don't know.
Hard times.
Talking about the death of the art world and
Yeah,
people.
One of the disciplined artists.
I think this also raises questions about, given that we know or understand this to be the kind of conditions or of the possibility of art continuing to exist, like how do we struggle around that then, you know, because I think that these questions around transnationalism in art and the kind of network and stuff informs the question of struggle, surely, because I mean, I would say that it's more likely that Goldsmiths will continue to exist in smaller institutions that do similar things but don't have as much reputation. So does fighting to keep Goldsmiths in existence come at the expense of, you know, other institutions, and how do we form a kind of a collective position that doesn't kind of become entrenched in the specific local area that we're kind of operating in? I think that's a, you know, a thing that kind of follows from a lot of what's been said today is, you know, how do we build that kind of network, and also how do we act kind of in respect of that network subjectivity or that kind of collective subjectivity. But it's very, very hard to do, I guess, in ways, because you can't see all of the ways in which the consequences of struggling in one part for, you know, what is, you know, by all means a just cause, kind of will potentially have a negative impact or come at the expense of other groups. I don't know if people have thoughts on that.
Erik hasn't said anything, maybe. It's your turn.
Yeah, I guess, huh? It's always the artists reflecting on the conditions of existence of art and artists, you know, the institutions that allow for the network to kind of exist. It's something that has always been puzzling to me as a non-artist, I guess, but very close to artists. And I learned to appreciate that art only exists in relation to some sort of institutionalization of itself. Like that's a Rancière lesson, you know, of what is considered art and how is art moving through the ages. And I guess we're at the crossroad here, because there's clearly a certain idea of art that maybe needs to die, just like Luisa was saying before, like a certain institutionalization of art that maybe doesn't want to die, but might die. And hopefully we can think of what it is to become an institution. What degree of interfacing do we need to assume on ourselves for what's coming next? I don't know. It's definitely the kind of thinking that comes to me after going into the depth of the financial. Like I don't see institutions in the same way as before. I mean, money is an institution in itself. Like we don't think of it in this way usually, but it is. So I guess we need to plunge here a little bit and see what our networks are made of exactly.
Yeah, I think along similar lines, I kind of, you know, I agree, but then, yeah, the question is always like infrastructural stuff that comes with, and this again, you know, like it gets caught again upon the questions that were being raised in terms of like what art can do. It seems like a lot of these projects are founded on the possibility of gaining funding for undertaking certain kinds of projects. So if art simply says that it can do without this, which is kind of the question that we're kind of entertaining when we're asking it, is, you know, can art fail in this sense? Then
I love the question.
This. Sorry?
Just for people who can't read it, is art or plastic art too big to fail? I think it's a great question you're asking.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not, right? But you know, then we still have these other problems, right? If we're willing to concede that art doesn't need funding, does it not just lapse into this kind of like localist and hyper-individualist thing, or does art need this kind of infrastructural funding in order to continue to like undertake the kind of projects we've been talking about today, how else is it going to find the money to do that? Or, you know, I instinctively want to say like it's fine for things like this to fail, because all I do is like basically on a computer, and once I have the computer, I don't have, you know, I just pay for food and I can live. But, you know, I think if other people are doing other things, it's not as easy to kind of allow art to kind of fall through the trap door and try and start again, because it seems like good work is still being done in those spaces. So for the rug to be pulled out from underneath, I think maybe that's something we should potentially fight against, if we see those projects as valuable. But, you know, I think that's a collective question also, and the problem is like a lack of ability to communicate that amongst ourselves in many ways, to make a decision on it, you know.
Maybe that's kind of like a good point to wrap this up, and just like think about the future with the examples that you guys gave. That was like great, at least for me. I really enjoyed this discussion, and hope it has been like the same for everyone else as well. The institution might die, yeah, of course. Should we just wrap it up here?
Yeah.
Yes.
This is another problem, right? That there's no clear and established protocols in the kind of transnational and like non-physical dimension, because, you know, we can't clap and we can't just like all have the informal rules and stuff. We need to work it out.
We can try to clap. I haven't clapped on Zoom yet.
Hope work it out.
Oh, you have a clap. Oh, you all can clap? Okay, it's just me.
Well, thanks everyone for the invitation and the discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really great.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
We couldn't see anyone's faces. Everyone is really
Stop.
also shy in this group.
Yeah, apparently people are clapping in their living rooms. I just got a message, so we got
the face of the institution, I guess.
Zoom is the new institution, the surviving institution.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right then. Thank you. Bye.